township of Ravenhollow sat nestled between ancient oaks and misty valleys, forgotten by time and progress in the shadowy corners of New England. By 1834, while cities bustled with industrial revolution, this settlement remained isolated, proudly clinging to tradition and the old ways. What travelers did notice, however, was the peculiar silence that greeted them at the township limits, a stillness broken only by hushed whispers and averted gazes when the Sullivan estate was mentioned. Records show that between 1828 and 1834, 23 young women from surrounding communities were sent to live with the Sullivan family as wards or household help. Of those 23, only 9 were ever seen again by their families. The others simply vanished into the sprawling manor house that loomed over the northern ridge, their names appearing in no church records, no cemetery plots, no passenger manifests of ships departing nearby harbors. A leather-bound journal, discovered sealed in the wall of the township's courthouse in 1897 and kept from public view until 1976, contains the troubled writings of Magistrate Thomas Hargrove. "I have again been denied permission to inspect the Sullivan property," he wrote in trembling script. "The family's influence reaches beyond our township, beyond even our state borders. Their connections to Philadelphia's medical society shield them from inquiries that would destroy lesser men. Would you sleep soundly knowing that such darkness could exist unchecked, protected by the very institutions meant to safeguard the innocent? The story I am about to tell you has no monsters lurking in shadows, no vengeful spirits seeking justice. What happened at the Sullivan estate was not born of superstition or madness. It was methodical, documented, and justified by the coldest rationality, and that makes it infinitely more horrifying. Ravenhollow existed in perpetual autumn, a place where fog clung to cobblestone streets and gaslight struggled against encroaching darkness. The air carried the scent of wet leaves and chimney smoke, but those who lived near the Sullivan property spoke of another odor that sometimes drifted down from the hill on windless nights. The sharp, unmistakable smell of ether and something else, something metallic and primal. The Sullivan family had established themselves in Ravenhollow 3 generations earlier, when Dr. Elias Sullivan, a surgeon who had studied in Edinburgh and Vienna, sought a quiet place to continue his research away from the scrutiny of his more conservative colleagues. By 1834, the family was headed by Dr. Thaddeus Sullivan, his wife Eleanor, and their 3 adult children, all educated in medicine at a time when such knowledge was jealously guarded by men in university halls. The township itself existed in the uncomfortable transition between superstition and science. While many families still consulted with herb women for ailments, others had begun to place their faith in doctors and their mysterious new techniques. The church maintained its grip on morality, but its authority was being challenged by the promise of rational progress. Women, particularly those of lower social standing, existed in this world as little more than property, their bodies and minds subject to the control of fathers, husbands, or in their absence, community authorities. Magistrate Hargrove's journal chronicles this tension with remarkable clarity. "The Sullivans represent themselves as harbingers of medical advancement," he wrote, "yet they operate behind locked gates, sharing none of their supposed discoveries. They speak of humanitarian purpose while keeping their methods shrouded in secrecy." It was Jacob Turner, a woodsman who supplied the Sullivan household with game and firewood, who first noticed something amiss. On a November morning in 1832, with frost still clinging to fallen leaves, he approached the servants' entrance with his usual delivery. The kitchen maid who typically greeted him was nowhere to be seen. Instead, a young woman he had never encountered stood in the doorway, her movements mechanical as she accepted his goods. "It was her eyes that troubled me most," Turner later confided to Hargrove. "They were open, but empty, like looking into a well that had run dry. When I asked after Martha, the previous kitchen girl, this new one simply stared as if she didn't comprehend human speech. Then she smiled, an expression that never reached those hollow eyes, and said Martha had been improved upon and sent to serve a family in Boston. Turner might have accepted this explanation had he not glimpsed, as the kitchen door swung wider, a familiar blue ribbon tied around the new girl's wrist. The same ribbon he had seen Martha wearing every day since he had gifted it to her the previous spring. When he inquired about it, the girl's face went blank before she abruptly closed the door in his face. For weeks afterward, Turner watched the Sullivan house from the edge of the woods. He observed strange deliveries arriving under cover of darkness. Crates marked with university insignias, barrels of chemicals, and once a shipment of glass containers that reminded him of those in an apothecary's shop, only much larger. He noted how frequently the lamps burned through the night in the east wing, a section of the house that servants whispered was forbidden to all but the family. What haunted Turner's dreams, however, was the sound he heard one December night as a storm battered the township. Between thunderclaps, carried on the wind, came a woman's scream, not of fear or pain, but of absolute despair, a sound so primal it raised the hairs on his neck. It ended as suddenly as it began, followed by absolute silence. When Turner brought his concerns to the local constable, he was dismissed with warnings about slandering the township's most respected family. When he persisted, speaking to the families of girls who had gone to work at the Sullivan estate and never returned, he found them reluctant to question their daughter's absence. Some had received letters, all suspiciously similar in wording, describing wonderful new lives in distant cities. Others had accepted generous, continuing compensation from the Sullivans, money they could not afford to jeopardize by asking uncomfortable questions. The image that Turner could not shake, the one that drove him to finally approach Magistrate Hargrove directly, was of Martha's vacant eyes and that blue ribbon, a token of affection now binding the wrist of a girl who seemed to have forgotten her own identity. By early 1833, changes had become noticeable in those few girls who did return from service at the Sullivan estate. Elizabeth Caldwell, who had worked there for just 3 months, came back to her family's farm displaying behaviors that disturbed her parents and siblings. Once quick-witted and spirited, she now moved through daily tasks with robotic precision, showing neither joy nor complaint. "She sits for hours staring at nothing," her mother confided to the local minister. "When asked a question, she sometimes pauses so long before answering that you wonder if she heard you at all. It's as if something inside her has been extracted." Most troubling were the gaps in Elizabeth's memory. She could not recall her childhood dog, though it had been her constant companion for 12 years. She spoke of her younger brother as if he were a stranger. When shown her own journal entries from before her time at the Sullivans, she studied the handwriting with clinical detachment, claiming no recognition of thoughts she herself had penned. Her father noticed something else: thin, precise scars hidden along her hairline and behind her ears. When questioned, Elizabeth offered the same practiced response. "I suffered a fall on the main staircase. Dr. Sullivan was kind enough to treat my injuries. I remember nothing of the incident." This explanation was delivered with such emotional flatness that it chilled all who heard it. Elizabeth was not alone in her transformation. Margaret Walsh returned to her position at the township's millinery shop, so altered that customers frequently failed to recognize her. She would stare at familiar faces with polite incomprehension until names were provided. The dressmaker's intricate work, which had once been her particular talent, now eluded her. Her fingers, previously nimble, fumbled with simple stitches, and patterns that had once delighted her creative mind now seemed to cause her physical pain to contemplate. Most damning were the nighttime episodes. Both Elizabeth and Margaret would sometimes wake screaming about the basement room and the chair with straps, only to fall into unnatural calm moments later, insisting they had never experienced such dreams and could not recall crying out. By morning, they would have no memory of these episodes and would react with mild confusion when family members appeared exhausted from a night of disturbed sleep. Medical examinations by doctors outside the Sullivan circle revealed little beyond general good health and some unusual patterns of scarring. When one physician noted that Elizabeth's pupils reacted abnormally to light, suggesting possible brain trauma, the Sullivan family quickly dispatched their own doctor, who declared the findings erroneous and threatened legal action for slanderous incompetence. As whispers spread through Raven Hollow, families began quietly refusing the once coveted positions at the Sullivan estate. In response, the family extended their search to more distant communities, seeking young women from impoverished circumstances whose disappearance would cause little commotion. They particularly favored orphans, widows, and those whose behavior had already marked them as difficult or hysterical in their communities. Among these new arrivals was Catherine Winters, a 22-year-old widow whose outspoken grief following her husband's death had led her brother-in-law to arrange her placement with the Sullivans. Catherine possessed qualities that set her apart from previous wards: a formal education, an observant nature, and a stubborn will that had already survived attempts to break it. From her first day at the estate, Catherine sensed the wrongness that permeated its walls. She noted how the other girls moved with synchronized precision, how they spoke as if reciting memorized responses, how their eyes seemed to focus slightly above or beyond whoever addressed them. Most telling was their collective silence whenever the East Wing was mentioned. "We do not speak of the treatments," one girl whispered to Catherine during her first week, only to claim no memory of the conversation the following day. Catherine began keeping a detailed account of life within the Sullivan household, hiding her writings inside the hollow base of a hairbrush, a trick her father, a journalist, had taught her for safekeeping important notes. She documented the strange routines, how certain girls would be summoned to the East Wing and return days later with subtle changes to their speech patterns or movements, how Dr. Thaddeus and his son would confer in hushed tones over charts bearing women's names and mysterious notations, how Mrs. Sullivan and her daughter would sometimes observe the household staff with clinical detachment, making notes on their behaviors as if studying specimens. Most disturbing were the night sounds, muffled conversations, the rolling of heavy equipment, and occasionally, despite the thick walls, cries that seemed to begin in panic and fade to whimpers before stopping entirely. Catherine mapped the house in her mind, identifying the locations of these sounds and noting which rooms remained perpetually locked. The Sullivan family initially regarded Catherine with approval, noting her intelligence and composure. "She will make an excellent subject for the advanced procedure," Catherine overheard Dr. Sullivan tell his son one evening. "Her mental faculties provide an ideal baseline for measuring the precision of our new technique." What the Sullivans failed to recognize was Catherine's methodical documentation of their activities. She recorded names, dates, procedures mentioned in passing, and sketched the medical instruments she glimpsed through partially opened doors. She noted deliveries of chemicals and equipment and the correspondence with medical institutions in Philadelphia, London, and Vienna. Catherine's opportunity for deeper investigation came unexpectedly when Eleanor Sullivan took to her bed with illness, leaving household duties unattended. Assigned temporarily to deliver meals to the family quarters adjacent to the East Wing, Catherine utilized these moments to glimpse forbidden spaces and overhear crucial conversations. What she discovered chilled her to the bone. In Dr. Sullivan's private study, left momentarily unattended, she found journals detailing cerebral modification procedures performed on dozens of women. The clinical language could not disguise the horror: targeted destruction of brain tissue to eliminate undesirable traits such as excessive emotion, independent thought, and moral obstruction to scientific progress. Most horrifying was the discovery that Martha, the kitchen maid who had supposedly gone to Boston, had never left the estate at all. According to the records, she had undergone multiple procedures resulting in complete cognitive reorientation and now served as living subject Narsham 17, housed somewhere in the East Wing for ongoing observation. Catherine knew her time was limited. Notes in the margin of Dr. Sullivan's latest journal indicated she was scheduled for initial assessment the following week. She had witnessed enough to understand what this meant. First would come drugged tea, then restraints, then awakening in the basement room where the chair waited. That night, Catherine carefully prepared. She transferred her most damning notes to a small packet sewn into her undergarments. She memorized the pathway to the rarely used servants' exit near the greenhouse. And she made a silent promise to the women still trapped within those walls. Their stories would not remain buried on that hillside. A violent thunderstorm descended upon Ravenhollow on the night Catherine chose for her escape. The heavens themselves seemed to rage against the Sullivan estate, with lightning illuminating the twisted silhouettes of ancient oaks against bedroom walls. Most of the household had retired early, seeking refuge from the tempest in sleep. Catherine waited until the grandfather clock in the hall struck 2 before slipping from her bed, already dressed beneath her nightgown. The storm provided perfect cover. Thunder masked the creaking floorboards, while the howling wind concealed the sound of her footsteps down the servants' staircase. What Catherine hadn't anticipated was encountering Dr. Sullivan's daughter, Eliza, working late in the study adjacent to the East Wing. As Catherine passed the partially open door, she glimpsed Eliza hunched over leather-bound journals, meticulously transcribing notes by lamplight. Catherine pressed herself against the wall, scarcely breathing, but a sudden flash of lightning betrayed her shadow. "Who's there?" Eliza called, rising from her desk. "Margaret, is that you wandering again?" Catherine remained frozen, knowing discovery would mean immediate confinement and acceleration of whatever procedure awaited her. As Eliza's footsteps approached the doorway, Providence intervened. A tremendous thunderclap shook the house, shattering a window somewhere upstairs. Eliza hurried toward the sound, and Catherine seized her moment, darting down the corridor toward the greenhouse exit. The rain lashed at her face as she fled across the grounds, the wet earth clinging to her boots. She didn't dare look back until she reached the edge of the woods, where Jacob Turner had once watched the house with growing suspicion. Only then did she turn to see the Sullivan estate, its windows glowing with unnatural purpose despite the late hour. Catherine followed the hunting paths Turner had described to Magistrate Hargrove, navigating by lightning flashes and the vague memory of directions whispered during a chance encounter in the township market. By dawn, soaked and exhausted, she reached Hargrove's modest home on the outskirts of Ravenhollow. The magistrate, initially reluctant to admit a bedraggled woman at such an hour, changed his demeanor completely when Catherine mentioned Turner's name and produced her packet of evidence. For the next several hours, Hargrove listened with mounting horror as Catherine detailed the Sullivan family's activities, corroborating Turner's suspicions with first-hand accounts and documentary evidence. "They're not merely practicing medicine," she explained, her hands trembling as she laid out her notes. "They're attempting to reshape the human mind through surgical means. They select women they deem problematic, those with strong wills, independent thoughts, or emotional natures, and systematically excise these qualities through precise damage to specific areas of the brain." The evidence was damning. Diagrams of surgical techniques targeting brain regions, before and after behavioral assessments documenting the erasure of personality traits, correspondence with European medical researchers interested in creating compliant subjects through permanent modification. Most disturbing were the financial records showing payments from wealthy families seeking to correct difficult daughters, wives, and sisters. Catherine's packet also contained something unexpected, a small vial of cloudy fluid she had taken from Dr. Sullivan's laboratory. "He called it cerebral extract," she explained with revulsion. "They're not just removing parts of these women's brains, they're preserving the tissue for study and experimentation." Magistrate Hargrove, though deeply disturbed, warned Catherine that the Sullivan family's connections would make legal action nearly impossible. "They have patrons in Philadelphia, Boston, even Washington," he explained. Men of influence who would not welcome scrutiny of practices they themselves may have commissioned. Nevertheless, Hargrove sent urgent messages to authorities in the state capital and to a journalist acquaintance at a respected newspaper. Catherine was hidden in the home of the local minister's widow, a woman whose own daughter had disappeared after taking a position at the Sullivan estate years earlier. 3 days later, when state authorities finally arrived to investigate, they found the Sullivan estate abandoned. The family had departed with astonishing efficiency, taking with them all equipment, records, and personnel. Only the building itself remained, scrubbed of evidence, save for a peculiar operating chair bolted to the floor of a basement room and strange circular stains that no amount of cleaning could completely remove from its wooden surface. More disturbing was the discovery behind a recently mortared wall in the east wing, 3 unmarked graves containing the remains of young women whose skulls showed evidence of precise surgical intervention. Without documentation, however, identifying these victims proved impossible. The subsequent investigation revealed the extent of the Sullivan family's protection. Inquiries were mysteriously closed without resolution. Officials who pressed too vigorously found themselves suddenly reassigned. The newspaper that began publishing Catherine's account abruptly retracted the story, citing unsubstantiated claims harmful to medical progress. The Sullivans themselves were rumored to have relocated to Vienna, where medical experimentation faced fewer restrictions. Unconfirmed reports placed them later in Paris and eventually at a private research facility in the American West, where their work continued beyond public scrutiny. Catherine Winters never fully escaped the shadow of the Sullivan estate. Though physically free, she lived in constant fear of retribution. Her testimony, ultimately dismissed by authorities as the ravings of a hysterical woman, haunted her until her death in 1867. She spent her final years in a small coastal town under an assumed name, still documenting her experiences in journals that would not be discovered until decades after her passing. The women who had undergone the Sullivans' treatments remained scattered throughout New England, many living out their lives as shadows of their former selves. Some families, recognizing the horror of what had been done, kept their daughters and sisters close, tending to them with quiet grief. Others, unable to face the truth, maintained the fiction that nothing untoward had occurred, attributing personality changes to women's nervous conditions or natural maturation. Jacob Turner, whose initial suspicions had sparked the investigation, disappeared shortly after the Sullivans' departure. His hunting cabin was found abandoned, the ashes in his fireplace still warm, but the man himself gone without trace. Local legend claimed he had pursued the family westward, seeking justice that the law had failed to provide. Magistrate Hargrove continued documenting the case long after official channels declared it closed. His journal, sealed away upon his death with instructions that it remain unopened for 100 years, contains perhaps the most damning assessment of the affair. What occurred at the Sullivan estate represents not a deviation from scientific progress, but its logical conclusion when divorced from moral constraint. These men and women did not act from passion or madness, but from the cold conviction that human beings can be reduced to malleable material. Their techniques may have been confined to that hillside mansion, but their philosophy pervades our modern approach to medicine, to social order, and to those we deem in need of correction. We have not seen the end of the Sullivans' legacy. We have merely witnessed its beginning. The township of Raven Hollow itself gradually faded from maps as residents slowly abandoned the community, unable to escape the shadow that lingered on the northern ridge. The Sullivan estate stood empty for decades before finally burning to the ground in 1889, a fire of suspicious origin that locals viewed as belated justice rather than tragedy. Today, little remains to mark what transpired there in 1834. The medical techniques pioneered by the Sullivan family, however, found their way into legitimate practice, stripped of their most horrific aspects, but retaining the core premise that the human mind could be surgically altered to eliminate undesirable traits. The modern lobotomy, popularized nearly a century later, would trace its intellectual lineage to those blood-stained journals that vanished into the night with the Sullivan family. When science advances without conscience, its greatest atrocities are not those left buried in forgotten graves, but those that silently enter the mainstream, cloaked in respectability and progress.